Hello all. I hope you had a good summer despite the circumstances. Today I will be talking about physical activity habits. And I will start the presentation with a quick introduction into habits in general. And I think the best way to segue into habit is with an example that I think all of us can relate to. And it will illustrate in a nutshell, let's say, some of the important features of habit. So all of us, when we started the race project, or maybe even before that, at some point in our lives, have moved to an entirely new city or in a new country. In other words, a completely new environment where you started to live, study, and work. Things that you used to do in your previous living place without even thinking about them now had to be rediscovered in your new town. Like the best way to commute to the university, the shortest and fastest way to get to the bus station, train station, on which station you need to get off, where to do your shopping and how your local supermarket is organized, where to eat, etc. And even with Google's maps and Google's suggestions, things may not have been that easy because even the simplest things are an effort. Like when you're trying to find something in your new local supermarket, you need to check where is the aisle that would have your desired product, and then you need to go through it and scan it to find it. Or when you're trying to get coffee on your way to work, Google will give you several options, and then you have to make a deliberate choice based on your based on the suggestions and stuff. And then walking there also, you will need to use the maps, checking every once in a while if you take a wrong turn or what. Also, you were introduced to new laws and regulations and how things are usually done in your new city and country. An example would be for us who came to Cyprus, where they drive on the other side. So, well, at first when I came here, crossing the street became somewhat adventurous, because every time I was checking if the road is clear to cross, I was checking in the wrong direction. So things may have gotten confusing and you might have gotten tired and even annoyed at some point. Well, this is because for a little while you were living a life without habits. And after some time and after some trial and error and maybe some embarrassing moments, you have found the best way to get to the university. You have discovered some nice shops and the best coffee shop on your way, and became able to navigate efficiently in your local supermarket. In short, you have learned what works and what does not work in this new environment, and things began to feel normal again, and your life started to flow again. This is because you are developing new habits. And most importantly, now that you have habits that you can rely on, your mind is becoming free to focus on other stuff, more important things. So you stop spending effort on these mundane behaviors. For example, if the first time that you went to the university from your place in this new city, you had to check the map a lot. Everything in the streets were new, like the shops or where to cross, the train station schedule or the bus schedule were new. You might have checked where to pay, how to pay, etc. But now, when you have habits, when you go to the university, you won't even think about all these things. Your mind probably will be focusing on something else. So you might be thinking about your work, what you need to do today, what you need to finish, or maybe trying to find an excuse to explain why you are arriving late to class. So from this example, we can deduce the following about habits. First, everyday life is full of habits, and we saw this in the example, but also in a study by Wood and colleagues, they pointed out that 1/3 to almost half of what students were doing every day can be classified as things that they do almost on a daily basis and usually in the same location. The second thing is that habits represent regularity. So our neural networks remember recurring contexts, and they also remember our optimal responses to those contexts. Also, if you think about it, this makes sense from an evolutionary point of view on the development of human mind, because dealing with regularities in our lives by forming and then using habits frees our mental resources so that they can focus on arguably more important tasks or stimuli. So the efficiency of habits will appear particularly under conditions of heavy load, such as stress, exhaustion, time pressure, etc. The third observation is that habit give us a sense of continuity. So our habits are experienced as a natural flow of events. However, in reality, you are making hundreds of small choices and decisions, like where to sit, where to look, what to take, where to go, etc. And we don't experience these behaviors as if we are making decisions, but if we face something unexpected or something important, this flow of experience will stop, and the heightened focused attention, let's say, kicks in, and this will allocate mental resources so that you can make a deliberate choice. So that's why when we said that when we moved to the new city, we felt tired in the beginning. But after a while, when we have formed habits, we didn't need conscious deliberations for these small behaviors. Finally, we form habits for things that work for us, for behaviors that work for us. So if we go back to our example, we formed habits for things like the best route to take to the university, the best shops that we like, etc. So we can say that most habits are formed in order to fulfill a desired goal. And these goals can be, for example, of a practical kind, like choosing the best route to take from point A to point B. And they can also be like for pleasure, such as having a sugary, tasty donut with your coffee on your way to work. So we have to be careful here, because when we say habits, we form habits for behaviors that work for us. That doesn't mean necessarily that these behaviors are good. So like having the donut, it's a bad behavior, or taking the elevator instead of taking the stairs, or using a car instead of a bike. Also, even though goals are in the heart of habit formation, by time they might fade away, and we are left with a tendency to respond to some trigger in a certain way. But we will talk about this in more detail in the coming slides. So from here, let's move to a more formal definition of habit. A definition could be cue-response associations in memory that are acquired slowly through repetition of an action in a stable circumstance. So first, people might act on their intentions, trying to attain some desired goal, like snacking at work will reduce hunger. And then as they repeat these actions, stable elements in the behavior performance context will start to associate with the behavior. And then after sufficiently repeating the action, perception of those stable elements in the context can trigger the behavior automatically, without the need for conscious deliberation. Like the sight of one's office might activate the snacking behavior, even in the absence of hunger. And from this, we start to notice that in the process of habit formation, the behavior control is shifting from goal dependence to context dependence. So now let's examine in more detail how goals and habits interact with each other. Many habits begin with goal pursuit, seen here with the blue arrow from goal system to context use. So goals influence habits for habit formation by driving people to repeat actions. Uh, the second is goal influence. The second influence is that the expression of the habitual response seen here in the activation or inhibition, the blue arrow from goal system to habitual response. So we have two cases. Once habits are formed, habitual behaviors are activated in memory automatically by a contextual trigger. However, when people are sufficiently motivated, they might inhibit the unwanted habit, despite it being active in mind. For example, if you're a smoker and you're having your morning coffee, this might trigger the behavior of smoking. However, if you have enough motivation or self-control or willpower, let's say, then you can stop this. Another example can be when you're entering your building where you usually take the elevator, but if you have enough motivation, you might decide to take the stairs instead. Also, if in the case of activation, if the motivation is positive, or in other words, it agrees with the habitual response, this might increase the energy to perform the desired habit, like running an extra mile. The final way that habits and goals interact with each other is through inference, seen here in the bidirectional green arrow. So this happens because people do not have a conscious access to habit cueing. Therefore, they might misattribute their own habits to their choices or desires. And this happens for desired, undesired, and undesired behaviors. So in the case of desired behaviors, the habitual response is attributed to some motivation or willpower. So for example, you think that you are able to frequently perform a behavior you desire to do because of your discipline or willpower, but it might be that you are simply performing a strong habitual behavior. And for an undesired behavior, the habitual response is attributed to temptations or suppressed desires, etc. So if someone has a behavior which is strongly habitual, and you ask, why are you doing this behavior? The correct answer should be, because this is what I always do, and not because of some sort of motivation or desire. Therefore, habituation implies the shifting from control, shifting the control over people's behavior from motivation or willpower to the behavioral context. And this point here has some major consequences for changing habitual behavior and forming habits, which we will see later on. So from what we covered so far, you probably noticed me repeating the word automatic a lot, or the sentence automatically activates behavior. So in recent studies, automaticity has been described as a defining feature in habit. But what is automaticity or automatic processes? So automatic processes tend to be efficient. This is because they do not require effortful attention or mental processing. They tend to be independent of intention. In other words, they can function in the absence of intentions or even contrary to them. Independent of awareness, so they can function without conscious awareness and can even be inaccessible to it. And they also tend to be stimulus driven. So they can be triggered directly by perception of elements in the environment. Note that these various features of automaticity may not co-occur. So what studies suggest that the best way to define automaticity is that the process needs to show some but not all features of automaticity to be considered automatic to some degree. So now let's move on to physical activity habits. There are some unique characteristics of physical activity that require consideration. First is the time needed to perform physical exercise. Well, it takes a lot of time. For adults, the World Health Organization recommends at least 150 minutes of moderate intensity physical activity in a week, or 75 minutes of vigorous intensity activity, or an equivalent combination of both. Also, WHO recommends aerobic activity to be performed in bouts of at least 10 minutes. Moreover, physical activity includes time-consuming preparation and transition actions. So these can include preparing your bag, transporting to the location where you will perform the physical activity, changing your clothes, showering, etc. And you are doing all these things and you didn't even start doing the physical activity. So if we take these 2 points together, it wouldn't be unreasonable to say that, okay, it might take somewhere from 30 minutes or more to have a session of physical activity. The second point is that physical activity takes the body out of the resting state. So studies have shown that physical activity activates affective and physiological responses. So an affective response is defined as the general psychological state of an individual within a given situation. And this psychological state can be emotions, moods, etc. So an example would be pleasure or displeasure. So this physical activity that activates affective and physiological responses are contrary to evolutionary aims of energy conservation. So studies have shown that people participate in activities that they enjoy, and the lower the intensity effort needed for the activity makes the activity more enjoyable. And I want to point out here that this is why the intensity of physical activity plays a role in the formation and maintenance of physical activity habits. Also, naturally, as the intensity increases, especially when it goes above the ventilatory threshold where your breathing is forceful and labored, the potency of discomfort increases. And the third characteristic is that physical activity is not a simple behavior. Compared to other habits or even health habits like taking your pills in the morning, physical activity is not that simple. On the contrary, it is a complex behavior spanning over a series of behaviors, as we said, from preparation to starting to performing the activity. So looking at these points, but with regard with the features of automaticity that we just saw, maybe habit will be able to explain why someone will turn off the light as he or she leaves the room, right? But can it explain how can an external cue be able to regulate this complex chain of behavioral sequences? And it takes 30 minutes or more. Also, we said that physical activity takes the body out of the resting state. So how can someone be having intense experiences of vigorous intensity physical activity and at the same time not having a conscious experience? Well, we noticed that there are some sensible arguments to refute a habit explanation of physical activity. However, there are still some other characteristics of physical activity that support the possibility of a habit explanation. So one important characteristic is that regular physical activity is a repeated behavior, which is, as we discussed earlier, an essential aspect of habit and habit formation. Also, physical activity has a high likelihood of being performed in the same context, increasing the likelihood of exposure to similar contextual cues. And this is, as we saw, is a predisposing factor to habit formation. Also, there are some studies showing that habit is a consistent predictor of physical activity. So even though these 3 points may support a habitual explanation, we still need to find some arguments, some answers to the previous arguments we saw. So luckily, there were some new advances in the conception of habit within physical activity science. So what is habitual behavior? In 2016, Gardner and colleagues, based on theorizing of Cooper and Chalice, deconstructed habitual behavior and proposed 2 accounts or 2 manifestations of habits. But let's first analyze more carefully habit and behavior. So, habit cannot be both the behavior and the cause of the behavior. So if we are describing habit as a form of behavior, then this would not be compatible with the accounts saying that habit is a determinant of behavior. So in other words, habit cannot be the behavior and also what causes this behavior. Moreover, as we discussed in the goal habit interaction figure, people can block unwanted habitual actions if they have enough motivation. So this suggests that habit does not directly generate behavior, but rather it generates an impulse, which, if not competed against with other impulses, will guide the action. So based on this, Gardner defined habit as a process by which a stimulus automatically generates an impulse towards action based on learned stimulus response associations. So within this definition, the impulse is a schematic representation of habit. And this impulse, unless overridden by other competing impulses, will guide the behavior outside awareness. And here we remember that the being independent of awareness is one of the automaticity features of habits. So we see that this characterization clarifies the distinction between habit as a process and habitual behavior as a manifestation of that process in behavior. To understand habitual behavior, we also need to understand how behavior is facilitated by habit. And this leads us to investigate action. So complex behaviors like physical activity portray action hierarchically. In other words, actions are composed of lower level sub-actions. For example, going for a run may be decomposed into sub-actions like putting your sneakers on and leaving your house. And these can be even decomposed further, like putting your right sneaker, tying your laces, putting on your left sneakers, etc. So note that people rarely consciously attend to these lower level actions. We represent actions at high levels of abstractions in our minds according to our motives or desired outcomes. And we don't tend to these procedural intricacies. As an example of a high level of abstraction of an action can be visiting a friend. So the intended outcome is, or motive is, to visit and see the friend, but we don't attend to the lower levels of sub-actions leading to this outcome, like changing your clothes, going to his place, ringing the bell. You don't think about these things. So based on this perspective, 2 stages of action is proposed. Selection of action, meaning the decision to act, performance, involving the completion and termination of the action. So considering this discussion, habitual behavior can be described in 2 corresponding accounts. The first account is habitual instigation. And this describes habitual selection and initiation of behavior. And explaining an example would be encountering a context like arriving home triggers a perceptually unitary action, like going for a run. And we say perceptually unitary action because, as we discussed, we represent action at high levels of abstraction. So arriving at home triggers going for a run, which, if not sufficiently opposed, translates directly into initiation, changing into running close. So from this perspective, we can say that going for a run is habitual, where the actor is automatically cued to select the going for a run action unit and begins enacting the sub-actions required to go for a run. So habit facilitates movement from pre-decision into action, and it bypasses the pre-actional deliberation, meaning the unawareness feature here. And a definition of this account can be that the habit process generates selection of a behavioral target, which, unless frustrated, instigates its realization into action. Of course, the completion of the action subsequently proceeds via activation of the lower level sub-actions. The second account is habitual execution. So in this account, habit is portrayed as a facilitator of progression through an action sequence. So after the selection of action, performance proceeds to completion through habitual activation of the subcomponents of the action. So with repetition over time, low-level actions become automated and become perceptually chunked into higher order sequences. So to clarify, let me give an example here. Let's say we have a new exercises who wants to begin a running program. In the beginning, the exercises will need to deliberate each aspect of this physical activity, starting from preparation, like choosing the best days to do the activity, choosing the best time of day, maybe what clothes to wear, etc. Also, the exercises in the beginning needs to deliberate about the enactment aspects of the behavior, like choosing the location of the run, like choosing which park or where to run, and choosing a route in the park, and the pace of the running speed, etc. However, over time, several of these sub-actions start to become automated and habits start to form of the higher order choices and actions. And even further in time, the exercises will start to form memories associating the end of the previous sub-action with the initiation of the next action. So eventually each sub-action will no longer need deliberation, but rather it will be automatically cued into action triggered by the context of the previous action. And the definition for this account is that the habit process activates lower level sub-action subservient to a higher order behavioral target. And so unless enactment of any lower level actions is frustrated, facilitates completion of the higher order behavior. So let's look at a figure that better highlights these points. In this figure, we can see the two accounts of habitual behavior, habitual instigation and habitual execution. And we can also see the corresponding action phases, the pre-action, then action, then post-action. It's in the lower part. The complex physical activity here is go for a run. And we can see that it can be decomposed into sub-level behaviors. Notice that habitual instigation commits the exerciser to an action and typically instigates the first sub-action within the sub-actions sequence. So here the first cue is instigating the put on sneakers sub-action. And what habitual execution does is it facilitates the progression through this sequence of sub-level actions. Also, the distinction between these two, the instigation and execution, has some theoretical and practical implication. So habitual instigation does not necessitate habitual execution. And in the same manner, habitual execution does not necessitate habitual instigation. So one person may habitually trigger to go for a run. So this is considered habitual instigation. Yet while running, this person may vary performance elements, like changing the route that he usually takes in the park to avoid boredom. So this is a non-habitual execution. Also, one may deliberate over to run or not, which is a non-habitual instigation, yet not attend mindfully to the unfolding chain of sequence of sub-actions. So this is habitual execution. So for example, a person who on weekdays, after finishing work, leaves the workplace and goes for a run in the park. So let's say the context cue here, the context cue that triggers the go for a run behavior is in the workplace. And on weekends, this exerciser doesn't run. But on some weekend, the exerciser might make a decision to go for a run. So here we have a deliberate instigation. So it's not habitual instigation. But after going to the park, he performs the run in the same way he usually does. Like the same route, the same style, the same pace, etc. So this is habitual execution. This distinction between instigation and execution may be less relevant to simpler behaviors that are composed of few observable subcomponents, like turning the light when you leave your room, where instigation and execution are not very much perceptible. But in the case of complex behaviors such as physical activity, this is needed. Because when we restrict our understanding of habitual behavior to be automatically instigated and executed action, in other words, all or nothing, this limits the capacity of habit to explain complex behaviors. But with this model, we have a more exact process of habit in physical activity. So if we go back to some of the objections that we saw earlier for a habit explanation of physical activity, we identify that physical activity is a complex behavior composed of a sequence of sub-actions. So as for the physical activity needing 30 minutes or more, since we identified the instigation and execution phases, well, the instigation phase is inherently much shorter than the execution phase. And arguably, it's a very short moment in time. So we can rebuff the argument that long duration of physical activity makes it unlikely to be driven by automatic processes like habit. As for the intensity and the affective and physiological responses which are activated by physical activity, the instigation phase, again, it's not during the process of the physical effort and exhaustion that we feel, which alleviates the contrasting viewpoints between automaticity and of the avoiding effect in physical activity. Okay, so in the coming slides, I'll talk shortly about forming physical activity habits. So as we saw earlier, habit formation is reliant on context-dependent repetition. So for a given behavior to become habitual, it must frequently be performed in the same context. We also said that goal or desired outcome is in the heart of the formation of a habit. And the literature suggests that goal setting, self-control are required for habit formation. So if the behavior is goal-directed initially, then until the habit is formed, enacting the behavior in the same context is reliant on your intentions and your self-control. So here we might wonder, okay, so how long do we need this self-control until the habit is formed? Well, this depends on the person, and of course it depends on the habit. So the more complex the habit is, the more time it will take. In a study by Koshel and Rhodes, they tracked new gym members for 12 weeks, and they found out that exercising for at least 4 times per week, 6 weeks, for 6 weeks was the minimum requirement to establish an exercise. And the duration to form the habit ranged between 6 weeks to 2 months. Seeing that this research suggests that the time needed to form physical activity is first unpredictable and quite slow, makes the reliance on intentions crucial until the habit is formed. But also simply sticking with a certain physical activity for some time with the hope that, okay, the habit will be formed may be too simplistic. So in another study, Koshel and colleagues showed that physical activity can be increased by making use of the principles of habit. So in this study, they tracked new gym members who had the intention to engage in physical activity, but they were not active, physically active. They randomly divided the participants into a control group and an experimental group. And the experimental group attended a workshop in the beginning of the experiment to help them establish a preparatory exercise habit. And by a preparatory exercise habit, they mean the phase preceding the exercise performance. Like when you prepare your gym bag, you prepare your water bottle, you change your clothes, etc. Also, they explained to them what habit is, behavioral requirements to establish habit. They discussed with them cues and consistency, and the importance of maintaining a consistent preparation practice. They were also instructed to develop behavioral regulation tactics, like to schedule the workout at the same time of day. So in short, the aim was to pair the behavior with the context cue. Even though both experimental and control groups with group members had the intention to do the physical activity, the result of the study showed that the experimental group showed a significant increase in moderate to vigorous physical activity after 8 weeks compared to the control group. Also, the experimental group showed an increase in practice consistency. So this suggests that although helping people to form physical activity habits, or to be more specific here, helping them to form instigation habits will not make the physical activity in itself less difficult and less complex, but it could work as a spark to increase physical activity rates. And since intention is associated with physical activity behavior, we will have a deeper look into how habit intention interaction happens, and we will present some new advancement in understanding intentions. So as we saw earlier in the goal habit interaction figure, behaviors originate with motivation, and over time, similar context cues will trigger the behavior. The supposition here was that the behavior control shifts from goal dependence to context dependence. Which will free the attention and effort to do other other things that require attention. So here, there are arguments that habit and deliberative motivation then may be mutually exclusive in their function on the behavior. So many studies have argued that intention has a strong, if not the strongest, predictive value of physical activity. And many scientists have used this in their intervention efforts to increase physical activity. And their supposition is that if you can promote positive physical activity intentions, this will result in subsequent behavioral enactment. So basically, people started focusing on mainly intention to promote and maintain physical activity. However, studies have shown that the intentions predictive utility have some discordance with behavior. And because of this, a new term was coined in the scientific community called the intention behavior gap. And I will try to explain this term by going over some numbers. So Rhodes and De Bruin conducted an analysis to study this relationship between physical activity and intentions. In this relationship, A person can be in one of four quadrants. So first, there are the non-intenders who are non-active. There are the intenders who are non-active. There are the non-intenders, but they are active. And also there are the intenders who are subsequently active. So in their analysis, they indicate that the people who are active and have the intention to engage in physical activity represent 42%, while those who are non-intenders, who are physically active, they represent less than 2%. So it seems that, okay, well, the most people who are physically active had a premeditative intention. However, the intenders who were not successful at following through with physical activity represent 36%. So taking the ratio of intenders who are non-active to the intenders who are active, we notice that the intention behavior gap of physical activity is 46%, which is a big number. So this suggests that intention is necessary but not sufficient for many people at following through with physical activity behavior. So considering this discussion, the scientific community started to focus more on intention, on the intention construct. And I will go over a couple of papers here to present these new conceptions of intention. So in a recent study, Rhodes and Rebar investigated the meaning of intention. So what they did is that they did a review of how intention is defined from both researcher perspective and layperson perspective. So for the layperson perspective, they checked how the word intention was defined in the most famous reputable dictionaries. And from the researcher perspective, they reviewed how intention was defined by different researchers in the field. Interestingly, they found out that in both cases, the intention concept comprises of two constructs. The first one is decisional intention, meaning that the direction of the intention, or your mental aim for a specific end state. The second one is intention strength, meaning the intensity of determination, or how committed you are to enact the behavior. So let's look at this figure. So here we can see the two constructs. We have decisional intention. Do you intend to do the behavior, with the answer being yes or no? So it's a binary decision. And the intention strength, going left or right, to what degree do you intend to do the behavior, which is continuous. So both meanings of intention are measured differently and have different underlying distributions of response. Furthermore, a couple of months ago, Gardner and colleagues published a paper proposing a new habit intention interaction hypothesis. So in addition to what we saw in the previous slide about the direction of intentions and the intensity of intentions, they also incorporated momentary self-control. And this self-control is required to translate your momentary intentions into actions. So when self-control capacity is diminished, people typically will fail to act on their intention. So the instigation of a behavior is more dependent on the habitual strength of the behavior. Okay, so let's look at the figure. In figure A, the self-control is diminished, and we see that the intention direction or intention strength have no influence on the frequency of behavior. So if the habitual strength of the behavior is strong, even though the intention not to do the behavior is strong, the behavior is still instigated and have a high frequency. So the straight line is where the habit is strong, and the dotted line is moderate, and the larger dots are weak habits. So here we can see that habits have the upper hand, and they basically control the frequency of the behavior. In figure B, the self-control is not diminished. So in this case, we see that when intention is strong, then it has the upper hand. And the relationship between habit and intention strength is dependent on the direction of the intention. So when self-control is not diminished, and when the intention of not doing behavior X is strong, so then it doesn't matter if habit is strong or weak. The frequency of the behavior is low, as we can see in the lower left part. But the intention is, as the intention strength weakens towards the middle of the figure, we see that habits starts to play a role again, and the frequency of the behavior start to increase for both moderate and strong habits. Now, in the case when you have the intention to do behavior X and the self-control is not diminished, we notice that as the intention strength increases, the frequency of the behavior for weak and moderate habits increase. So I think these figures summarize beautifully how habit and intention affect behavior. But of course, as we said, this is a new hypothesis and should be rigorously tested. And I want to finish with this note. As we saw earlier, that physical activity requires time, energy, and is made up of a complex sequence of actions, which might suggest that the behavior involves some deliberative processing or intention. So it may be that habit and intention are mutually exclusive influences at a particular point, but the complexity of physical activity allows for aspects of the behavior to be both intentional and habitual. Therefore, the recent studies suggest that an oversimplified or all or nothing approach of explaining physical activity is not an appropriate way to investigate its relationship with deliberative motivation or intention. Thank you very much for your attention and time, and I hope I was able to give you some good overview of habits in general and exercise habits in particular. And if anyone have any questions, I'm happy to give some answers.
Thank you very much for your presentation, John.
Thank you.
And so does anyone have any questions?
Hey, thank you for the presentation. I was just wondering about some generic thing, that is, how is what is the impact of an environment on this, habit formation? So for example, if I am today in Sweden and I am working towards forming a habit intentionally, and then for some reason, let's say in a secondment, I go to another place, how is that going to impact the habit? Is it a part of something that you're looking into?
Yes. Oh, there is a study shows that if you change your environment, so because the core thing in habit theory is that cues will trigger the behavior unconsciously. Okay. So if you change your behavior, if you change your environment, then the behavior will not be triggered automatically. So you have to do some deliberative decisions to, or for example, if you're going for a run, in this new environment, a cue will not instigate the habit. A deliberative instigation will happen. And then maybe after some time, if you repeat it, then you don't need to have this deliberative instigation. And the deliberative instigation is dependent on your intentions, the intention direction, how much is strong your intentions, Okay, and then how much self-control you have. So if you are going through stressful moments, you have 10 things to do in one day, so maybe your self-control will be diminished. So it depends on all these things, if you will be able, if you change the environment, if you will be able to do it directly.
Okay, I see. All right, thank you.
Thank you.
So I also have a question.
Yes.
Talking about, in particular, sport activity or exercising, it's a kind of activity that might sometimes necessitate some non-habitual execution in order to be of high quality. So you might want to change your exercises every now and then, change your routine, or maybe increase it once you are, let's say, becoming better and better trained. So, and I was thinking, once you need this kind of non-habitual execution, then you need, let's say, in the middle of your routine, you need this kind of deliberation, and that is a moment when some negative influence might come on your deliberation. So, for example, laziness and this idea that you want to save energy, and that maybe you're making a lot of effort and you are not enjoying too much. So, might it be the case that to have a good, varied exercise, you actually need to have a lot of motivation and self-control, while if you have only motivation and self-control in the first period when you're building the habit, then you might, let's say, not be able to evolve it easily. You might, because when you try to evolve it, you might actually leave it due to some negative influence. So is it the case that maybe trying to use habits to overcome this kind of lack of long-term motivation might actually lead to suboptimal exercise patterns?
Yeah. So yes, so basically habits is when you don't have enough motivation and you don't have enough self-control, you will fall on your habit. So if you have the habit of exercising, you will do the habit of exercising. But as you said, it might be probable that, yeah, okay, you might not change or you might not evolve. But here also we have to think about how this thing is happening. How are you changing? What is the intensity, the increase of intensity in your physical activity, right? So if this is happening in a more studied way, then maybe you don't need that much motivation and self-control. But these are hypotheses. Like I don't have numbers to say, but yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Sorry. And one question from my side, similarly to your work, also my work, let's say, is quite based on more theoretical concepts. And something that I usually think and I, let's say, contemplate about is how you can, let's say, integrate these theoretical concepts into your more tech-oriented work. How do you think you are going to overcome this issue? It's not so much of an issue as more of a challenge, I would say. But how do you think of incorporating these theoretical concepts into your work as a computer scientist?
Well, it depends. Like if, for example, if I'm gonna do the measuring of habit, then knowing these small things will be helpful while looking in the data and seeing how can I connect this point in the data, where I can find this thing in the data. So I don't have a clear idea because I didn't see the data yet, but I think it's a matter of connection between the theory and where you can find it in the data.
Yeah, this is definitely an interesting point.
Hey, John, I have another question which kind of follows from Sophia's question. So let's just looking at the graph that I'm seeing right now. So here you have, like on the right hand side, you have intention to do a behavior and the intention to not do a behavior. So basically here, what I'm trying to understand is this something that, like, you know, the authors of the paper measure through some in matrices, or is it something that you gather from a questionnaire? Because if I'm thinking about gathering it from a questionnaire, then if I ask someone who wants to do an activity, like, you know, or let's say he wants to form a habit of running, he or she wants to form an habit of running, then in that case, if I go through a questionnaire, then initially the intention to the behavior to do that particular behavior will mostly be strong. So I was thinking if this is something which is more latent, or this is something which can be figured out by looking at some form of data which I do not know about. So like, are you also thinking in the same line, or am I sounding not so, like, you know, logical?
Yes, you're right. So basically they do questionnaires. So it depends on the experiment also, if it's a longitudinal experiment or not. So maybe they do this questionnaire every week or every other day to see how these things changing. But yeah, this is actually something that we might check in the data and see if we can find somehow a way to find this information.
Yes, because I mean, and like, so I mean, the questionnaire is well and good. It's fine. Even like if you ask it every day, then it's, if you track it, and if the, like, you know, the one who is being questioned is being totally honest, then that's one thing. But I was thinking, if looking at other forms of, like, you know, like data which is not really related to the question, whether you can figure this particular answer out as like, you know, as it kind of sits in a latent space. I mean, it's not really very clear. For example, I usually go out for a run. So if you ask me whether I'll go out for a run today, that's something like, yeah, I would probably go out for a run. But if you ask if I'm going to do that tomorrow, then that's something that I don't know yet. So basically, as you can see, the habit has probably not been formed yet, but I also do not know my intention sitting at this point of time.
Yeah, exactly. And you don't know how much self-control you will have the next day.
Exactly. Yes.
So, yeah, you're right. So yeah, this is basically the challenge, is to how we can connect.
Formulate the whole thing.
Yeah,
Yes. Mhm.
yeah.
Yeah, it's an interesting problem. Thank you for the presentation.
Any more questions, guys? Then I think if there are no more questions, we can thank again John for his very interesting presentation. And I think it will be very helpful for many of us, even if we don't work directly on this, also for personal awareness of how our own habits even work. So thank you very much. It's been very, very interesting.
Thank you.
And yeah, see you guys in 3 weeks. Now we will start again with our usual schedule every 3 weeks, one presentation until December. So yeah, thank you very much everybody for attending.